They're coming to get you, Barbara.
It has been established that persons who have recently died have been returning to life and committing acts of murder. The unburied dead are coming back to life, seeking human victims.
This week on a podcast from Beneath, The Omen. Mr. Poe, how's it going?
I'm kind of scared now. I've watched The Omen and I kind of see things happening. No, I'm doing good, man. I'm doing
Erik, how are you doing?
I was doing well until Mr. Poe showed me the photographs of me that he took earlier with the strange discoloration moving closer and closer to my neck.
William, how you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm still recovering from watching 5 Omen movies, including the remake. I didn't watch the series, so I thought that was going too far.
And you failed at your task, sir. You did not complete
I did
your
read
homework for this show.
I did read half the book, so I
did more than I did.
That was one thing I was wondering if this was based off of a book.
It was based off of several books.
Well, okay, there you go.
Well, actually, it's the reverse. David Seltzer did a novelization of the screenplay, and he managed to get it released before the movie was released. And everybody assumed that the movie was based on the book. The book was an enormous bestseller. It's one of the best-selling horror novels of all time. And it's actually better than the screenplay because he was able to patch up a lot of the mistakes that he made in the logic and the storytelling.
I thought it was interesting because I watched, I watched the documentary. And actually, I watched 2 different ones, and one of them was the better one. But anyway, I like how he came up with the idea. That was just so cool. Like, he was just, it just kind of hit him, the idea.
Well, he also had a little bit of impetus because the producer he owed money to, apparently. This is the story. And the producer...
There's a movie!
There's a story he thought... He's done so many interviews over the years that it's hard to get the exact story.
That's what I found, yeah.
But he told one version of the story where the producer came to him and said, I want something like The Exorcist, because The Exorcist was making so much money. So he said, I don't want to do that. I don't believe in any of that shit. And then I guess the producer reminded him that he owed him money. But it was a good thing for him because he probably is still living off the money he made just from the book alone. And they keep making Omen movies and TV shows. Presumably he gets a piece of the action every time they do that. On the remake, he actually got sole credit because the script was so similar to his script that the WGA decided that he should get sole credit.
Wow.
So I assume a paycheck came along with that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, the whole history of these novelizations it's very, very fascinating because, as I'm sure we'll get into, there was the first Omen, and then there were 2 subsequent Omen films that were made by 20th Century Fox, both of which were novelized. And then the series went dark, at least theatrically, after the third one. But there were 2 more novelizations that were produced that were based upon what the original plan for the film series was going to be. And it's really, really weird the way, and I'm sitting here and I'm looking at I've got a first edition copy of the original Omen novelization. And you're right in that it came out first. I think that Seltzer wrote the screenplay. The screenplay was shot, and then he did what was very, very popular of the era. We saw this with Star Wars as well, where the author of the screenplay either writes or ghost writes, has somebody else write for them, a novelization that is pushed out into the stores a couple months ahead of the film. That's how they promoted a lot of films back in that time. So the Omen and Star Wars being a year away from one another, that makes sense. Now, the reason I bring all that up is the fact that there's a note here at the beginning of the book that is explaining that there are certain discrepancies between the book and the film down to character names. For
Yes.
some very, very strange reason, characters have different names in the book than in the film. But presumably, the book is based upon the film that is based upon the screenplay, and yet you have the book having different names.
Well, he said that he changed the name of the Gregory Peck character. Apparently, Peck didn't like the name, or the director didn't like the name. They had some other name for whatever reason. There was an association to a particular name that they preferred.
Jeremy Thorne was the,
right.
Yeah.
And when he did the novelization, he went back to the name that he preferred, which seems like kind of a pissy thing to do. It's like,
yeah, but it also goes to Patrick Troughton's character, the evil priest. He has a different name. The Jennings character that David Warner plays also has a different name. It's littered all throughout. And then starting with the second book, based on Damien Omen II, the names conform. The names that are referenced conform to the film rather than.
Who wrote that? The other books. I assume he wasn't involved.
The other, yeah, you're correct. The novelizations for, let's see, the novelization for part 2 was written by Joseph Howard. Then the third film was novelized by Gordon McGill, who also wrote the books then for Omen IV, Armageddon 2000, and Omen 5, The Abomination.
The Abomination should have been the name for the whole series, in my opinion. But I think what they were trying to do is get a Star Trek publishing setup there. They had a franchise. Presumably they made a shitload of money with the first book, and they wanted to have an ongoing franchise that would actually survive the series of films. I mean, sometimes they make films simply to keep the publishing franchise alive. They did that with Alien, apparently. It was the toys and the comic books that made them say, let's do another Alien movie, back when they were doing the one where Sigourney Weaver comes back as a superhero. I forget which one that was, the third one? Or the third one was... Fourth one, right. But the story that David Seltzer has told, he was attending the dailies and he saw the scene of David Warner's head being cut off and flying around. And when he saw that, he said to himself, I got to go write a novelization of this because this is going to be big. And he had the idea in mind because Eric Siegel had just had a big hit with, it was not Eric Siegel, I forget his name. It's Jonathan Livingston Seagull, was that movie about a seagull. And it was written by a guy who previously had written, I think, the screenplay for The Yellow Submarine. Anyway, that was a sort of minor sensation as a book. It was apparently the first time they actually novelized a screenplay. Before that, this is like 1971, I guess. Before that, they would publish the screenplay. They would modify the screenplay. I had a copy of the screenplay for Westworld, which was published as a paperback novel, just like The Omen. But inside, it was just Michael Crichton's screenplay. It wasn't turned into a novelization. Well, when they did the novelization for Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and it was a big bestseller, I guess that's where David Seltzer said, I got to do the same thing. So he rushed home and started writing. And I guess the reason why he made changes is because he wanted it to be a separate and distinct work. And that was probably wise because when I look back on The Omen after I saw the movie, I was a big fan of this movie when it came out. I guess I was like 13 or 14 years old. I was just crazy about it. And I saw it with an opening, weekend audience, and everybody in the audience just went nuts for it. And for a while, I was obsessed by the thing. The first thing I did was run out and buy the novelization. And back then, if you wanted to own a part of a movie that you loved, the only way you could do it was to buy the soundtrack or buy the novel. I read the novel. I thought the novel was fantastic. It really influenced me. I can see that now in some of the screenplays I was writing around that time. But when Star Wars came out, I forgot all about all that shit. Omen, schmomen. I wasn't interested in it. And I haven't watched the film in 30 years.
Wow.
And I think the reason why I always had it in my mind that this was a great horror movie was because I was remembering the book. The book is a very solid piece of work. The movie, I don't know if it really works as a horror film so much anymore. It almost seems like a comedy now.
Well, didn't they say, like, the director, and like you said, the two documentaries I watched, they kind of counteract each other in some of the things they say. But one thing he did say is he didn't consider it a horror movie. It's like more of a thriller.
Thriller, right? Yes.
Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, what do y'all think? Well, Carey, what do you think?
I think it's more of a thriller than it is a horror movie. But I kept thinking like, anything biblical always seems to be turned into like a horror movie. You know, you've got the Omen, the Seventh Sign. But I don't think it's horror. I think it's more of a thriller.
Well, maybe what he was trying to say was that he approached it as a thriller, and that was probably a wise choice because he avoided anything that was overtly supernatural. Everything could be explained as a coincidence or an accident, and that Richard Donner, you come to really appreciate his work when you see the remake, or when you see the sequels. Because I was prepared, after just watching The Omen again, I was prepared to be down on the film. And then I watched the sequels. And I watched the remake, and I said, oh yeah, Richard Donner really knew what he was doing, because he avoided all the mistakes that the folks who made the subsequent films, one of whom was actually a pretty important director, Mike Hodges, who's a British director. He's the guy that directed Get Carter and Croupier and I'll Sleep When I'm Dead. He's very highly regarded. He's dead now. He also did a movie version of The Terminal Man, Michael Crichton, on the Michael Crichton novel. And he's a very good director. He was fired from The Omen II because they thought he was taking too much time. But apparently some of his stuff is still in the movie. So they had intelligent people involved, talented people involved in the sequels, but they didn't seem to make the right choices as far as the type of story. They didn't seem to understand what made the first film work, I think.
Right.
Well, I'm going to go to my grave defending Damien Omen 2. I think that, it's interesting because it falls into that sort of category where I know objectively that the first Omen is the better film, but I feel like I enjoy Damien Omen 2 more than the original. And I think part of that is the fact that, let's face it, The Omen was trying so very hard to be 20th Century Fox's answer to The Exorcist. They wanted to make a big devil film that would scare the hell out of people or the hell into people. And because, before 1973, for the most part, horror films going back, there'd been Psycho in 1960, but for the most part, horror films, you had either sort of drive-in schlock like what the Hammer films were, or you had exploitation cinema like Last House on the Left, and then later on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and other films of that ilk. Horror was not a genre that was regarded as being, a classy, you weren't going to see opera if you went to go see a horror film. And then The Exorcist comes out and took itself so very seriously. And, Friedkin said so many things along the lines of, I didn't approach it. Same way we're saying about The Omen. I didn't approach this as a horror film. This was a drama where, so much of what was happening just, so happened to appear supernatural. And The Omen is very much cut from the same cloth. And so it's being The Exorcist, or trying to be The Exorcist, albeit with its own spin on it. And I love The Omen unconditionally. Omen 2, though, is sort of like, it's like Exorcist 2 or even The Exorcist 3. I love when the first sequel always takes this very kind of weird turn, because there's no franchise yet. There is a hit film, but what the franchise to be is going to be remembered retrospectively has not yet been determined. It's not typically determined until the third film. And so these sequels where you get Exorcist 2, or you get Damien Omen 2, or Nightmare on Elm Street 2, before there was a formula, and the filmmakers were just trying to do the next thing and put their own stamp on it. And then people react typically very strongly you know, in opposition to that, at which point you see sort of what worked in the first one recycled in the third one. And so Damien Omen 2 for me is the one that stands out because it is told largely from Damien's perspective. He's not inherently evil. It brings up the question of nature and nurture. It brings up all sorts of, you know, the idea of suspicions of destiny and coming into one's own and becoming a man and taking your first steps, your rites of passage. Damien Omen 2 is about learning to accept the family you've been born into instead of the family maybe that you wished you'd been born into. It just deals with these very, very different themes that you don't see then in the final conflict or even in Omen 4, and certainly not in the remake.
I sort of feel that with the Omen franchise, it's a fairly crass commercial thing. One thing, and we talked when we spoke about The Exorcist, we talked about the unfortunate effects of The Exorcist and how films like The Exorcist may have eventually led to the Satanic Panic. And at least we can say about The Exorcist, it was from the heart. I mean, William Peter Blatty really felt he was sending a message to the world that was worth hearing. And he also, to his credit, didn't say that the solution to a demonic baby was to kill them. And unfortunately, with The Omen, which is a very shallow film, and it is entirely intended, even by David Seltzer's own statements, it's entirely intended as a commercial venture. It's a Jaws plus The Exorcist. Give the audience a thrill ride, right? And yet it has what I think might have been more lasting negative effect. I'm not blaming David Seltzer or Richard Donner for crazy parents that kill their children. But unfortunately, that's, if you go on Google and you do a search, which I did, I looked at as many of these as I could stand, it's been a fairly consistent thing going on now, certainly since 1976, and might have been before, but certainly since 1976, story after story of mama decides that she has to stab her child to death because she thought it was had demons in it. A daddy decides to drown his baby child because it has demons in it. Over and over and over again. Well, where do people get these ideas? Even David Berkowitz saw The Omen and he saw The Exorcist. And when the time came to create a sort of mythology about why he's going around shooting people, he referred to The Omen, right? I mean, Son of Sam is a dog told me to do it. Well, that's The Omen. I mean, where else would he get that idea? I don't think that was a popular concept. And the funny thing is, probably the only reason they worked those black dogs into the movie was because they were looking at The Exorcist. They saw, well, The Exorcist started with a scene with dogs, so we got to get some dogs in this picture somewhere. And it was a natural thing. Rottweilers are nasty-looking animals, you know. I'm sure they're very sweet, but...
Am I the only one who remembered Doberman Pinschers instead of Rottweilers when I first watched it as a kid? For some reason, I remember them being Dobermans. I don't know why.
Well, in the remake, they swapped out the first Rottweiler with what appears to be some sort of German Shepherd Husky mix, which was a very stupid move, I thought.
Yeah.
I mean, why would you want to have a cute looking dog, you know?
Well,
one thing I would say about Richard Donner is he had an eye for creating these sort of sinister images, and that was one of the most effective scenes in The Omen when the nanny hangs herself. And it's
well, I mean, let's talk for a second about the death scenes, because I mean, you know, when we think largely about slasher films from that era, just, you know, post Omen, starting with Halloween and going forward in 78. But when you start looking at slasher films, the thing that everybody talks about is how characters were dispatched. The kills are always, you know, what you are there for specifically, the tits being number 2 and a story being a dead last. You are there for these memorable setups and you know, executions of characters. And I feel like The Omen is really where that began, more so than even, you know, the stuff that Savini was doing on Friday the 13th, you know, or even if we start looking at the, you know, the Italian films that influenced that whole wave over here. The fact is, The Omen had these incredible, you know, whether they were, Rube Goldberg machine sort of kills, or they were just these out of left field moments, like the nanny hanging herself at the birthday party. The kills were so very weird. They were very weird. None of these things were the sort of deaths that would strike you as being conventional, particularly in a film of this sort. There was a touch of weirdness to each one of them, in which the death felt so out of place that in some ways that was more effective than the death itself. The idea of a priest being impaled by a church spire right out in front of the chapel door, or a nanny committing suicide by hanging herself at this big gigantic paparazzi swarming political birthday party for a little kid, and certainly not David Warner getting his head cut off by a sheet of glass that just happens to get thrown by a vehicle when the e-brake releases itself. I mean, they're just so bizarre that's what makes them so shocking.
Well, what I liked about the death scenes, and I don't know if Donner done this on purpose or if this is his style, but there was a long lead up to the death scene, and then just like whenever the priest is stabbed, he lingers on it afterwards for way too long, where it starts getting like a little bit uncomfortable. And I don't know if that was his style or not, to have
I think
that little build up to the death.
Yeah, I think the same thing is true with the photographer's death. It's one thing to have the head cut off, but then to go back and show the head with a startled expression being reflected in the glass, that really is the thing that chills people. If it had just been the head being cut off, it probably wouldn't have had the same impact. But Donner did have a knack, and Quentin Tarantino said that he thought that this was Donner's best directed film. I think I agree with him. Donner has a way of building the tension and suspense, so that when a death occurs, it's extremely dramatic and powerful. That whole scene with the nanny hanging herself is a good example. And to compare it to the remake, that is so botched that you really do appreciate Richard Donner and his editor, what they did with the original film, because the guy who did I don't even know his name, he's done some other movies recently, but he even has, at one point, they have like a Punch and Judy puppet show going on for the children. So Donner focuses mostly on Lee Remick's wide eyes. Lee Remick must have the widest eyes in show business. And when she's looking startled and hugging her baby, and that is an impressive image in itself. You really feel the horror of the scene just by looking at her. The remake, the guy goes and shows all sorts of reactions from different people, and he stops to show the two puppets looking up at the nanny hanging out the window. What the hell does that mean?
All right, so I'm going to pick this back up with, where would this movie be without Jerry Goldsmith's score?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a terrific. It's nonsense Latin apparently, but we won't hold that against him. It's very impressive. And I found myself after watching the movie going around with that in my head for the past couple of days. So it's very memorable, obviously. I don't know for a modern audience, though, it's hard for me to say because I'm not a modern audience, but I don't know if the music might be a little too much. It almost, in some scenes, creates it's also hard to tell because there were so many parodies of this movie after it, something like that almost seems like a comedic music cue now. But it's certainly effective. It certainly was effective the first time. I don't know why he decided to go in such a different direction with the second film, but maybe he figured, I won an Oscar for this. I have to do something different.
Didn't he didn't that soundtrack get nominated?
It won.
Least?
Yeah, I think it won.
It won?
Yeah.
Whatever that opening piece that with the Latin
Ave Satani.
Ave Satani. Yes.
There you go.
That one, I don't know if it was best song. It might have been best song.
I don't
It's hard to
know.
believe.
Yeah.
Somebody told me that they were watching the Oscars that night and they had a musical number for that with nuns dancing. I don't know if I can credit that account, but I'm going to do further research on that.
Yeah, we got to find that.
It probably wouldn't be beyond the Academy to do something like that.
If it isn't real, it needs to be real.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we need to make it so.
Oh, there you
Maybe
go,
they
Carey.
maybe they
The
can do
dancing number.
the Omen on Ice. How about that?
The Omen on Ice.
I think it's really interesting that, you know, Goldsmith does go in a very Baroque, very operatic direction for this with, you know, all the, you know, sanguis bibimus corpus edimus, you know, all the bullshit Latin and chanting and stuff. And you're right in that on the one hand, it's beautiful. It sounds like a Catholic mass in hell. But at the same time, I think that it can, in moments, render the drama melodrama and be unintentionally funny, but still, I mean, still wonderful. It's just, it's maybe a nudge too far over the cliff. You know, that's the thing with horror. You push it a little too far and it starts becoming funny.
Right.
And I think that that's what happens a bit, but the score is still amazing. And I think the score for Omen 2, though it did go in a very different direction, I think it's a better score in a lot of ways. I don't care for the third film, which to me feels like a, you know, it sounds like Ben-Hur. It sounds like the Ten Commandments, because in many cases, it basically turns into one of those old widescreen, you know, very gaudy Bible movies at the very end. But yeah, the first two movies, the score is fantastic.
Well, also
and again with Omen 2, I like the way the score deviates from what won the awards. It kind of forges its own path.
Well, I suppose he should be given some credit just for trying something different. I think the real problem with the second film is that they didn't, in my opinion, they didn't realize that the effectiveness of the first film was due to the fact that the creature of evil was kept at a distance. We experience everything through Gregory Peck or through Lee Remick or through David Warner, and we don't know what to make of the child. Whereas in the second film, we get to know the kid too much. And to be honest with you, some of the stuff like him going out and standing on the lake edge and screaming, "Why me?" That might work in a Star Trek movie, but in a movie that was supposed to be taken seriously, at least in the moment, it's ridiculously melodramatic, and we don't know how he's supposed to feel about this. The first film, it's like an arrow, it moves exactly straight forward towards its target, and there isn't a spare moment wasted on any sort of silliness. It knows exactly what it wants to do. In the second film, it's like we get a little of this, we get a little of that. We got Lance Henriksen as a military academy teacher or commander or whatever they call him. And we got
Robert Foxworth.
Robert Foxworth with his furry hair hat. I can tell that guy, I don't know if he's still with us. I hope so, because I'm sure he's a nice man. But I can tell you why he never became a big star in movies, because that is a ridiculous looking, I don't know if it's a wig or if it's his actual hair. But.
And let's face it, he was also kind of the poor man's Robert Reed in that era.
Whatever possessed Robert Reed to go to that haircut, I don't know. But maybe that was the thing then.
Now, do you think in part two that, I mean, you kind of like, you're like sympathizing with the Antichrist? Do you think that's the way it's
Yes.
supposed to have been, or I mean,
It
Well-
was, but that's part of the problem with it, because I agree with you. It's like I said from the beginning, I will die defending that movie.
Hopefully
I
it won't
love
come
it.
to that, Eric.
Hey, look, the way my year is going, it would not strike me as outside the realm that
So we're
when
gonna
somebody-
have to check this video afterwards to see if
Yeah.
there's any lines drawn on the picture.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to tell you, my son is going to be telling his son someday about how his grandpa died and was literally defending Omen 2 as he did. But,
It's like his dying breath.
but nonetheless, Omen 2 is like, again, it's like Elm Street 2. It's like Exorcist 2. It's weird. It's different. It's not better. It's definitely not better. But in some ways, it's more interesting to talk about because what is so great about those original films is so obvious. We know what's so great about it. Part of what makes these weird part twos so good is that even if they strike out, even if they don't hit the mark, they did their own thing. Even if it failed, it was attempting to be of the same visual and narrative language as its predecessor while still doing something different and not simply recycling the first one again. And I think that Omen 2, the minute that you are forced to sympathize with the Antichrist, it can't be scary at that point.
Yeah.
It cannot be frightening. You have just hobbled your entire concept. But if we are now watching it as a sort of gothic melodrama, as we're saying, if we're watching it as a gothic melodrama that is going to have, once again, some incredible death scenes, some really, really vicious death scenes, a couple of which I think are actually better than any of the death scenes in the original. And I'm speaking specifically of Joan Hart getting attacked by the bird and then run over by the tractor trailer. That is fucking amazing. As well as Hollywood from Mannequin getting cut in half by a cable car.
Yeah.
Also amazing. But at any rate, the point is, it's not scary, but it's very, very interesting. And sometimes interesting is just as good to talk about.
Well, what I always wonder about is why is it, and I agree with you, often movies that are bad or failures are more interesting to talk about because we can consider what would we have done. And I am always surprised that what's so obvious to me, what seems like a lead pipe cinch, that they should not have done it that way. And I say to myself, well, how would I do it? I say, oh, I know, they've given us the answer. He has a stepbrother. So the story is about the stepbrother slowly learning that the brother that he cares about so much may be the Antichrist. And he's seeing all these people around him dying, but it's kept at a distance, right? And he gradually pieces it together. And then he's confronted with the question, do I do something about this? I love my brother. He's the most important. We're inseparable, but he's the Antichrist. And that puts him in the same position that Gregory Peck was in the first film. What they wanted to do instead was they wanted to find another old Hollywood movie star to step in and, they got William Holden, who actually turned down
the first one, right?
Here he is doing and there's nothing dramatic about his situation. The whole movie is him sort of ignoring everything until towards the end when suddenly he decides, no, it's not a coincidence. I got to kill my kid. And then one of the more ridiculous things, he says, let me take my wife along because she'll want to be there when I do it, right? It doesn't occur to him that that's something that you should really do on your own. If you decide your child is the devil baby, that you shouldn't bring your wife along, right? And of course, it's such a mechanical thing. They wanted to have Lee Grant in that scene because she supplies the ending of the movie when she turns on him and stabs him, right?
Which, I mean, come on, that was a fantastic jump the first time.
It was a surprise, but the thing of it is, when you look back on it, you see how mechanical it is. And also the precision that we had in Richard Donner's movie, it's missing here. The director doesn't have the sense of drama that Richard Donner has, or the sense of drama that Steven Spielberg, who was Donner's, I assume he was going for a Spielberg style. The last scene first of all, they have the furnace blowing up, which is silly. And then they have the kid coming down the steps of the museum, right? And when I'm watching this, I'm thinking, okay, we're going to see the fire engines pull up right in front, and the firemen are going to be rushing up the stairs, and they're going to be attaching fire hoses, and the kid is going to be slowly walking down and getting in his car, and that'll be the end of the movie. Instead, it looks like the fire engines are going someplace else. They couldn't afford the fucking fire engines. They got the lights and the sirens, but they never pull up in front of the place that's supposedly burning. That's a miss. That's not getting the dramatic beats right. The same thing with when the old lady dies. The way that scene should have been was she wakes up in bed, she sees the crow gives her the stink eye, cut. Then the next morning, the wife goes into a room and finds it dead on the floor. And maybe if you wanted to put a little extra twist on it, you could have the crow peck her eyes out, right? Just to give it a little gore. But the dramatic beat is she looks up, she sees it, cut. You don't hang around and watch her ogling the raven. I guess they were crows, right? I don't think they were using ravens. I know there's a distinction between them. But
what did y'all think about, and I find it interesting, I love the behind the scenes stuff. And what do you think about the like the curse part of it? I mean, a lot of it is kind of weird, especially
they were just trying to generate the same thing that The Exorcist had.
Yeah, and I was thinking that too, but a lot of that stuff is pretty weird, man. And I don't know if everybody was in on it just to get the hype up. I mean, what do you think?
Okay,
what do you guys think?
I'm going to say two things. The first is this, just circling back for 1 second. You were talking about the ending of Omen II and the fact that William Holden takes off to go get the daggers of Megiddo, with which he's going to kill Damien, and Lee Grant goes chasing after him. And that's how I always took it. I never took it that he was luring his wife to go see him kill the kid. The point is that she was a guardian, that, you know, she was the most insidious of the guardians because she'd been placed right next to the kid, hiding in plain sight. She was the whore of Babylon. So I really enjoyed the fact that she's chasing after him, and we're just taking that as she's chasing after him because her husband's freaking out.
He didn't make any effort to hide his plans from her, which is mystifying to me. And the only reason that would be the way they would set it up in the script is because they want her to come along. Gregory Peck's character didn't have that choice to make because his wife was dead already, but he didn't include anybody else in the killing of the child, because a logical person would assume if somebody's coming along with me, then that means they're probably going to try to stop me, because what I'm doing is not going to be explainable in any sort of rational way. All I'm saying is that I suppose there is a way that could have been done so that it would have made more sense to me, at least. But the director staged it in a way where it seems kind of clunky and obvious that they were just going for a certain ending and they were bending. I mean, logic and reason are, you know, not something we should expect to find in any of the Omen movies, including the first one. There's all sorts of absurdities, like Mrs. Belloc just sort of traipsing in and saying, "I'm your new nanny," like Mary Poppins. And
I was gonna say, when I was rewatching today, I was like, the Thorns, they're either naive or really dumb.
And you know something? One of my favorite things about Mrs. Baylock that was not in the film, but was in the book. So I don't know if it was in the screenplay or not, but the reason that the housekeeper and his wife quit the Thorn employ is because Mrs. Baylock, I think it's actually Mrs. Blaylock in the book, but Mrs. Baylock is going out and shitting in the woods behind the house. Like they've caught her out there shitting in the woods like an animal and covering her own waste, and that she's doing other things like that on the premises that are the way an animal would act rather than a person.
Well, we hope that she's just shitting in the woods. I mean, maybe there's something else she's using the shit for, or maybe she's a creature that doesn't have to shit. I mean, the whole reason they make that assumption is because they're keeping track of her toilet paper. Not having to replace a toilet.
What about when the first, I guess, nanny or housekeeper, whatever you want to call her, whenever that scene when she looks at the dog, and then, of course, they focus in on the eyes and stuff, like it's communicating to her.
Yeah.
and then she offs herself, and I was thinking, okay, was that like, hey, you've done your part?
Yeah,
You know, when he was a baby to now he's 5?
Hypnotism, I
mean,
think. I took it that the dog was sending a signal and saying, now you're going to go kill yourself.
Right, but that's the problem. You're actually pointing to the sort of absurdities that are a problem with the script. They're not really a problem because the director moves quickly through these things, and he approaches it with such a dramatic in such a dramatic way that you don't. It's sort of like James Bond films. They do stuff that they know is going to get a reaction from the audience, and they don't care if you go back later and say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make a lick of sense that if this is some sort of organized thing to put the Antichrist in a position of power, that all the people that are trying to help the Antichrist are going out of their way to behave as insanely as possible. It doesn't make any sense that Mrs. Belloc would constantly defy Lee Remick and Gregory Peck. It doesn't make any sense that she would bring the dog into the house to make that an issue, because any reasonable person in any other situation would say, Mrs. Belloc, pack a bag and get your ass out.
Yeah, you're fucking fired.
Take your dog and leave. You like the dog so much, he's yours. Out the door with you.
Yeah.
And she goes out of her way to confront the people that she should be as nice and polite to as possible, because she's the person that's protecting the child. So that doesn't make any sense, but it's a dramatic moment when she defies Lee Remick, when Lee Remick says, bring my child out, and they have that tense moment where she's saying, I don't think you should take the kid to church. It sets up the church scene, right? The church scene wouldn't work as well if you didn't have Miss Belloc saying, I don't think you should do this, right? So that's a setup, even though it doesn't make sense for the character to be doing that. Yeah. Also, the nanny, you could say, well, they got that nanny out of the way so that Mrs. Belloc could come in and replace it, which I suppose makes sense. But why tell the nanny to do her suicide in such a spectacular way? That only makes it more likely that they'll be more security conscious when the next nanny comes in, which they are.
Which they weren't.
It doesn't make sense, right? It's
okay,
like,
so
here's the keys to the house.
So
here's our social security number, and here's our credit cards. You take over.
All right, here was this has always been my interpretation of it, and this is not informed by any text in the film or in the novel. So this is just my interpretation. I thought about that as well. I was like, would not the deaths be more subtle? And this doesn't necessarily, remove that question from the conversation. But I will say that I always took it that the nanny committed suicide specifically to, what's the word I'm looking for? Desecrate the family home. Right. That through the act of suicide, Mrs. Blaylock could enter the home and do the shit that she was going to do. Again, that doesn't,
Well, I took it that way. When I first saw the film, I thought that this was some way of celebrating the
It's a sacrifice. It's some sort of ritual sacrifice.
But it goes again. I mean, according to the book, they only have one chance every 1,000 years to get this right. So to be engaging in these celebratory things or these ritual things that simply draw attention to what they're doing, when they could just be quiet and go about their business and not be killing every fucking person that comes along that looks sideways at them, that is actually detrimental to their plans, because no reasonable person would ever say there's the Antichrist unless they notice all the bodies around him, right? Then they say, well, maybe he is the Antichrist.
Well, that's because evil is gaudy. And that goes back to the earlier question that because of me, and I apologize, we went on a tangent about, but the question of, did all of the behind the scenes supernatural stuff happen? And I think that I'll just echo Mr. Hopkins' earlier statement, which is it's bullshit. It's PR. It sells a movie. It sells, a magazine with a story about the movie. It was clearly modeled after The Exorcist, and right down to there's a wonderful documentary that I don't know if it's on the most current version of the Blu-ray set, but going back to the DVDs, there was this documentary called the OMEN Legacy, and there are numerous actors or individuals who are associated with the entire series of films who just roll their eyes at that and say, yes, it's bullshit. It's total bullshit. It was Harvey Bernhard, the producer, who was, telling all these stories to the press. And that raises the question again, whether it's The Exorcist or it's The Omen, does ultimate evil choose to reveal itself in so blatant a way around the making of a feature film? Is that actually in sort of what we would expect the behavior of Satan? Is that in the realm of what we would expect from Satan, to be that gaudy? Or is that out of character?
It also raises a larger question, and it becomes even more of a problem in the third film. Let's say this guy is the Antichrist. What is he going to do? I mean, the whole idea of the stuff in the book of Revelation, that referred to Rome, Emperor Nero, or whoever replaced him as the persecutor of the Jews. That was the Antichrist that the book of Revelation was warning against. The book of Revelation was not written to predict what's going to happen in 1976. What possible reason would anybody in Jesus's time or shortly after Jesus' death sit down and go, I got to let people know 2,000 years from now what might happen? That doesn't make any sense. Why would anybody be bothered with that? It's about what was happening at the time. And so the idea that an Antichrist will come in the modern world and establish some sort of empire of evil, well, what would that look like? And how would we distinguish it from the way things are right now? I mean, is Damien actually going to be a greater threat than the people that we have running the country now? I can't imagine how he could. I would actually think he might do a better job. The devil might have at least enough sense to realize that he's got to take care of the basic maintenance of the country, right? That you can't be evil all the time. There's a problem with the Bond villains too, right? The Bond villains prove what tough guys they are by killing their subordinates. So you're not going to have many subordinates if you keep doing that, right? People going down, right? You're sending people into the piranha trap, and I mean, the idea of the Antichrist is an absurd idea, because a religion or a movement based on evil is an absurd idea. The satanic church that we have now is a group of atheists that are trying to show people the absurdity of the way we regard religion in our society. It's not actual people that think that we should be sacrificing babies or anything like that. And actually, a lot of the image of the Satan, the classic image of Satan, are really just Greek, Roman gods, right? Pan is the figure that we have, what we would consider the devil now, the horns and the cloven hoofs. And, it also has been something that anti-Semites have made some use of. The image of the devil for a long time in our history has been very Semitic in appearance. So these concepts really were more about what sort of fantasy or mythology can I come up with that will allow me to hold on to power and to punish my enemies. The devil is a great way to do that, right? I just asked all those women hanging from ropes at Salem, right? They ended up being accused of witchcraft, not because anybody really thought they were witches, but because they wanted to get their property. Right?
Yeah.
They weren't dying fast enough, and their relatives are saying, maybe we should help her along.
Looking back at all that, and that's so funny you brought that up, is just thinking about, and even with these movies, the time they came out, I think people still had that, I guess it's not really as, I guess people don't, it doesn't scare them as much as it did back in the day.
I agree with
you. You know what I mean? Like the 70s, there was still a lot of religious stuff going on, and people were still, oh my God, this girl got possessed by a demon. And then you have the Omen, oh my God, the Antichrist could be walking around among us. And then, nowadays we got so much social media, and we can see what's going on wherever in the world.
Yeah.
No, and I guess people, kind of like, okay, well, and then you can look up, what was the first religion? What was the first established religion? Well, it's Hinduism. So it's like, well, are they right or am I right? everybody was raised a certain way or had a religion to base their, mom and dad believed this, their parents believed, and all that stuff. And then when you get older, you start having your own perception. Right. And I guess, those movies back in the day, that's why they worked.
Well, I also
everybody still was scared of stuff like that, and not as much anymore. Or am I wrong?
It was the first time in Hollywood history that anybody was making a movie like that, right? Where they were saying that the end times may be coming and the antichrist may be coming. And so it had a certain novelty. But I also think that with The Exorcist and with The Omen, you're seeing a sort of counter-revolution. In the years from the mid-60s to the mid-70s, you saw the new Hollywood with morally ambiguous films like Bonnie and Clyde and Parallax View, and films that were not crowd pleasers. And there were two components. There was the new style of production, which was to take the cameras out and shoot in real places and sometimes use real people, as Friedkin did in The Exorcist with the priests. And the other aspect of it was that moral ambiguity, not having happy endings, having anti-heroes, not trying to create a sort of like a satisfying, emotionally satisfying experience for the audience, but to challenge the audience and to give them a bitter pill to swallow. Well, that went on for a while, and there were some great films made in that period. It's probably the best period in the history of film. And then the studios began to have successes like Jaws and The Exorcist and The Omen and Star Wars and Rocky. We often forget Rocky. Rocky came out the same year as The Omen. And they said, hey, wait a minute. We can take the production aspect, the new way of doing production, shooting in real places and trying to get that sort of gritty realism that the new Hollywood films have, but we can tell old-fashioned stories, and they'll be much more effective now because we're using, they have greater verisimilitude, they feel more real, right? So this is Hollywood's way of clawing back the market, right? They didn't, the studios were uncomfortable with the idea that they had these crazy hippies making these movies that some of them were big hits, but some of them were not particularly successful. You have films like Easy Rider. Can you imagine what people like Gregory Peck must have thought of Easy Rider?
Oh, yeah.
So now, and Peter Blatty really, he deserves the credit for this because he's the guy that said, if I'm going to do The Exorcist, I got to get a guy like Friedkin. Friedkin was one of those new Hollywood guys, right? He was the one that was always talking about the European filmmakers, and his influences clearly made him the best person to take this old-fashioned story about devil possession, demonic possession, and make it as intense and believable as possible. And this movie is really just following up on that. This is also a film that largely shoots in real locations, probably more than they needed to, and has a feeling of reality to it that makes it work. The remake is, of course, done in the modern era. Everything is CGI'd. I mean, there's some scenes there where they looks like they're doing green screen work with just two actors talking to each other. I don't know if you guys have seen the remake.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
They had a scene later in the film when, in the original film, it's David Warner and Gregory Peck, and in the remake, it's Liev Schreiber and the fellow, I forget his name, who plays the photographer, and they're sitting in an Italian outdoor cafe. And I swear to Christ, some of those shots of the two of them talking looks like it was done in front of a green screen, right?
Well, it's possible it was. I mean, if you look at that movie in general, the sheer amount of green screen is, I mean, it's incredibly embarrassing when they try very unsuccessfully to recreate moments that were very iconic in the original film. Obviously, the Jennings character being decapitated. That incredible bit of trick photography that Donner did where Lee Remick falls from the balcony and lands on her stomach on the floor. Once you know how that effect was done, and I'm not going to spoil it for anybody here, because once you know how that effect was done, it's all you can see when you watch the film subsequently. But it's brilliant. It's brilliant. Because it's one of those impossible looking shots that was all trick photography. Amazing. It's outstanding.
They ruin the rest of that scene by giving us the impression that Damien is doing it intentionally, which is not the case in the original. In the original, He's doing his little tricycle wheelie wheels, and the nurse opens the door and lets him go out into the hall, and we don't have any way of knowing if he's doing what he's doing intentionally. It could be an accident.
Right. Well, and then that's the least of the sins committed by that remake. You know, the remake also, you know, rather than saying, hey, let's do some, you know, trick photography and pull off something that's otherwise impossible, it's Julia Stiles lying on a green screen, and you know the effect is comped in behind her. It's just as egregious as the Nightmare on Elm Street remake doing the character being thrown across the ceiling. I mean, it's terrible. It's absolutely awful.
This also brings up one of the little logic problems with the first film. If the nurse didn't want to have her hands on this murder, and she lets the kid do it so it looked like an accident, right? And Lee Remick is laying, presumably near death, on the floor. Why do they call the ambulance? Why didn't they let her die?
Well, because I didn't take it that they were trying to kill her. They were trying to kill the baby.
Okay.
And
Well, that raises another question. If their main purpose was trying to kill the baby, then why would they send Belloc in again to kill her in the hospital when it's very likely that she would be discovered, and especially when she kills her in such a spectacular fashion, she pushes her out the window.
Because Thorne and Jennings escalate it. They start doing their globe-trotting adventure, and they're getting nearer and nearer to the baby.
Yeah. She's already at that point.
Because
why would you risk?
Because the trail is leading them to Bugenhagen, who has the daggers, at which point there needs to be some sort of an alibi or rationale for why Thorne's behavior is what it is. The guy's lost his mind. His wife is dead, you know, after, you know, first he loses his unborn child, and then his wife dies in this freak accident, which, by the way, is really fucking mean. It's really mean. It's mean. Yes. She doesn't just get dropped out of a building. She doesn't just get dropped out of a building onto the top of an ambulance so she can blow out the windows. She does it while she's stuck trying to change her hospital gown. Yeah, it's just embarrassing and mean and awful, and I love it.
Yeah, it almost came off as comical. I'm just like, this should be like in a Naked Gun movie.
Well, like William was saying, a lot of this stuff comes off as comical now when you go back and you watch it.
It seemed shocking at the time, and I know the audience I saw it with just gasped when
they're like, "Oh my God!"
Well, I mean, come on, you know, we were saying a little while ago that, you know, for the most part, horror was it was junk food cinema. It still is, but you know, it was really considered junk food cinema in that time. And The Omen is just, you know, it's a Hammer movie with higher production values.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because particularly when they got to the cemetery scene, I thought, even when I saw the film originally, when I was 14 years old, I thought, Hammer could do something like this. And I can't understand why. That was just the time when Hammer was going out of business, and everybody was saying, well, they can't compete with films like The Exorcist and The Omen. They could have made a film like The Omen.
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
The reason why they went out of business, and maybe I should save this for your future Hammer episode, the reason why they went out of business, besides the internal changes with new people coming in, was because they never did a second draft of any of their scripts. They didn't treat their projects like blockbusters, like Hollywood was treating them. They didn't do stuff like the amount of effort that William Friedkin put into The Exorcist, or the amount of effort that Spielberg put into Jaws, or the amount of effort that they put into The Omen. Their attitude was, we got a 20-day schedule, we got $1 million, get it done, and we can start working on the next one. And we'll put them both out on a double bill at the same time.
It was very Roger Corman. I mean, right, you know, you remember a lot of those productions, like when Christopher Lee very famously shot Dracula, Prince of Darkness, and Rasputin back to back. Same cast, same sets, same costumes, completely different characters.
And they put them out on a double bill.
Yeah, exactly.
So everybody could tell, oh, we recognize that. That's the set from the other movie. But that is what, in my opinion, that's what killed them. They could have said, we're not going to do that anymore. And rather than doing, they had one year where they had 2 Dracula movies in 1 year. That's not making movies, that's making TV shows. Mm-hmm. You should say, we're going to do one quality movie, and we're going to get the best writers. They had access to people like Richard Matheson, who did one of their best films. Let's get instead of allowing the producer or the guy who runs the studio to write the scripts. I said, none of that crap. Get decent writers and write good stuff. Hire somebody like David Seltzer. I mean, the thing that David Seltzer had done before The Omen was being sort of like a ghostwriter on Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and writing the Hellstrom Chronicle, which was a bogus, sort of like an artificial documentary about insects taking over the world, but actually won the Oscar for Best Documentary, or nominated at least. So he had a history of sort of taking factual information, like stuff from the Book of Revelation, and playing with it and turning it into something that would scare or upset people. One mystery that comes to my mind is why he was never able to do it again. His next film after The Omen was Prophecy, which was a stinkeroo. You know, I mean, that was just a terrible movie. And I think probably, if I can guess, the first movie was an example of him being crassly commercial and doing something for the money. And the Prophecy came along and said, now I'm going to do my dream project is going to be socially conscious, and I'm going to bring up all these social issues like pollution and all this. And of course, it was horrible. Nobody.
Well, he also had, you know, Richard Donner. He had Richard Donner with The Omen. And
yeah, but he had John Frankenheimer with Prophecy.
Yeah, but you know, that's latter career John Frankenheimer. Yes. Not even latter career at this point. But nonetheless, he was no longer at the top of his powers, whereas Donner was kind of on his way up. You know, it was this, and then it was Superman, and yeah, but if we're talking about, you know, we keep talking about era, and we keep talking about the years in which this was released, and, you know, looking at it from that sort of historical context. Has anybody else taken a look at least the first three? The three that were released by 20th Century Fox theatrically, and tried to figure out exactly what year any of them are taking place? Because,
we assume the third one has to be taking place in some sort of future. Right?
Okay, but in each case, you've got, all right, so you've got The Omen in 1976, and Damien is 5. And then you've got Damien Omen II in 1978, 2 years later, at which time Damien is 12, turning 13. So that means that either we are now in the year, what, 8 years after that, so we're now like in 1984, or we're saying that Damien Omen 2 took place in 1978, and that the original Omen took place 8 years before that, so 1970. But then we get to Omen 3, and Damien is 33, and that's 1981. So, are we doing the math backwards? Or is Omen 3 in the future from 1981, and we're seeing like an alternate millennium? You know, what year are we in?
I think that they definitely wanted us to assume that Omen 3 was taking place in some near future. And I think even the discussions of the Israelis bombing some dam and all the sort of topical things are all about fictional stuff that we assume is meant to be futuristic. I mean, in the first film, they have somebody, Thorne's assistant, say something about inflation. So clearly that was meant to be said in 1976 because inflation was on everybody's mind at that time. The second one, I guess, has to be a little bit into the future because you're right, the kid is far too old. He's obviously not just 2 years older than a 5-year-old. So that is a little bit into the future. And then I guess the third one has to be intentionally set in a fairly distant, not a distant future, but certainly well off in the future, so that all those little political things and the stuff that's happening on the world stage with Israel and whatnot, it can be sort of made up and not refer to anything that was actually happening at the time.
But if that's the case, then Omen 3 is taking place in an alternate 2004 in which power mullets, wide lapels, corduroy jackets, these are all sort of the norm.
Yes, they've all made a comeback in 2001.
That's a scary alternate reality.
Did you see
it's pretty much like that now. A lot of stuff from the 80s is coming back.
That's true.
In 2020.
Right, yeah.
So maybe the Antichrist is returning. It's a sign of it. But did you see the fourth one?
Of course.
Now, is the fourth one the one where Damien's a girl? Or am I-
Yes.
That's right. Yes.
Okay, okay. I
And
haven't seen that one in forever.
that one was supposedly made in 1991, right?
That was 1991 from
Now, was it made for TV?
Okay, so
it ended up on TV.
So yes, it was made for early Fox in 1991, and the whole idea was that Fox, it's the same thing we were talking about when we were talking about Sleepaway Camp a couple weeks ago. We were saying that there came that point where during the VHS boom of the mid to late 80s, a lot of these smaller companies, people like Roger Corman, were going and saying, which movies only had a part 1 that we can scoop up the rights to, put a 2 at the end of that title, and release it direct to video on VHS in stores.
Like
and so you saw
Leprechaun 2.
What's that? Say it again.
Leprechaun 2.
Leprechaun 2. But you got your Sleepaway Camp 2, you got your Slumber Party Massacre 2, and that's kind of the same model with the Omen 4. Since Fox owned the rights to this, they premiered what was essentially supposed to be a pilot episode of what was going to be an ongoing series. And the 2-hour pilot was called Omen 4, The Awakening, and was essentially a soft reboot, what we now call a soft reboot, that more or less remade the original Omen, but updated it for modern times on, maybe a tenth of the budget, adjusted for inflation.
It certainly looked like a TV movie, and there's so much bad stuff in that you could do a whole show about it. Even sort of silly, cheap mistakes that they make, like at the very end, they have a funeral, and it's bone dry. There isn't a raindrop in sight, but they want to have the guy holding an umbrella. Right? They walk off because they're so attached to the idea of funerals in the rain are supposed to be atmospheric. But it's a bright, sunny day. Everybody else that doesn't have an umbrella, he has an umbrella, and he walks off into the distance at the end of the movie holding an umbrella. And it's like, where was the money to bring in a couple of trucks to have some rain or to fake it in post? But the other thing about that movie is it didn't really feel like it was 1991. It felt more like 1980s.
It did. Now, are you familiar? I don't know how deep you go down the rabbit hole on the Halloween films.
Not too
well, Halloween 5 is the second film in a row that was directed by a French, I'm assuming he's French based on his name, Dominique Etienne Girard, I believe is how you pronounce his name. But he also directed Halloween 5, which is the second worst of the Halloween films. And in the case of both Halloween 5 and Omen 4, he was fired and replaced, or either replaced a fired director. I'm not sure. That's
if he was fired, it's certainly understandable.
I'm not sure about all that trivia. Hopefully somebody that's listening to this can tweet at us or Facebook at us.
Yes.
Well, one thing I would say about the fourth one, it has a very hilarious scene in it when they go and visit the crystal spiritual people, the fair.
Oh my God, the psychic fair is amazing.
That is hilarious. I mean, why does the little girl need any sort of supernatural power when apparently everybody will kill themselves? They'll set themselves on fire. Okay,
all right. That actually raises a really good question. And that is, all right. We already kind of talked about the timeline of the Omen films. So if we're talking about Omen 4 as being Omen 4 and taking place in the same universe as the first 3. In fact, it's even referenced at the very end that Delia, the little girl, is Damien's daughter by some machinations. Right. He sired her before he died. So at any rate, all right, now we are in the future, an indeterminate amount of time after Omen 3, so it's post-2004. And we are living in this weird pocket universe where children who are all clearly 10 to 12 years old are in preschool. I could not determine how old this child and her friends were supposed to be.
Oh, you're right.
because they are very clearly not in elementary school during the school scenes. And I don't know how old they're supposed to be, but you know, there's like kids wetting themselves and getting scared of climbing a ladder.
Right.
But it's all very, very weird. And I know that's common practice to use older children, or in some cases using adults rather than teenagers, you know, for labor laws and all of that. But it's really strange the way that children are presented in this film.
That's a flaw I hadn't even thought about. But I mean, I thought of that psychic fair thing. For a clever director, that would have been a great opportunity. He could have had the little girl come and make great friends with all these people. They have no idea that there's anything wrong with it, right? Except maybe for one. There's some old lady in the background, a gypsy or something. Look out, the beast. That would make sense. That would be dramatic. That would be dramatic in the same way that some of the scenes in the first film would be dramatic. You don't have everybody who lays eyes on them start to pee their pants because they're, oh, the devil child is here. Are we supposed to believe that everybody who attends a psychic fair has the ability to see the Antichrist when they pass among them?
Well, it also raises the really interesting question of how are we supposed to regard the psychic characters in Omen 4? Are we supposed to view them the same way that we view heroic priests in the earlier Omens or The Exorcist? And we're like, yeah, they're God's cops. Well, or are we supposed to be looking at the psychic people, and are we supposed to be laughing at them?
I view them as avatars for the writer or the director. They clearly they have some sort of thing in their minds about the importance of working in references to healing crystals and all this horseshit. So they thought, oh, this will be new. This will be a clever idea. And of course, it's not a clever idea because people that believe in healing crystals, they don't go by the Old Testament or the New Testament. I mean, modern spirituality and that sort of stuff, that doesn't have any basis in the Book of Revelation or anything like that. Those people wouldn't be expert in finding the beast, right? It's just a mishmash, but apparently somebody involved with the production felt strongly about, crystal healing and all that sort of jazz, and they worked it in. But it's a ridiculous scene. I mean, it really is hilarious. They have one guy there, I guess he's supposed to be blind, and he's just like, eye wide. Like, I don't know if maybe they left out in this, maybe there was some reference in the script that he actually is blind. Then they have the juggler setting fire to everything. I mean, just absurd stuff. And the funny thing is, the nanny is just sort of quietly taking the child away as the whole fucking fair burns down and people are on it. I mean, that seems like a strange reaction.
I gotta see this.
I've got to find it because I remember seeing it like when it came on TV, whatever year that was, but I haven't seen it since. I got to try to find a copy of it now.
It is so handcuffed by the limitations of 1991 television that it's trying so desperately to shock and horrify through the repeated and progressively more desperate use of the image of the inverted cross. And the film is trying to find interesting and symbolic ways to show you an upside down cross, and it just becomes hysterical. It turns into a drinking game.
I thought that scene where Michael Lerner is running through the streets and I guess the Christmas carolers they pop up in front of him. They're all like zombies and
and the one's got the inverted cross and it's just
naturally,
like yes.
God.
He's gonna try to help Linda Blair out, I guess, with her.
Yes, exactly.
But that sort of silliness is just, it's hard to imagine sometimes when you see these films that anybody was looking at the dailies, because you would think somebody in charge would say, hey, take away their credit card or their checkbook. We're not going to spend any more money on this piece of shit. But they go ahead and they make them and they finish them and they put them out. I guess in Australia, this was actually released as a feature film. Sorry, Australia.
I want to go back to a couple things real quick. The Lee Remick falling off the balcony. Is it done the same way that they did the investigator in Psycho falling down the steps?
No.
Okay.
No.
I was just trying to
Okay.
guess
All
that.
right. Do you want me to tell you?
Sure. Yeah, it's not gonna roll for me.
All right.
I like
Spoiler
behind the scenes
alert.
stuff. Yeah.
If you are listening to this right now and you do not want for this scene to be forever spoiled, skip forward 30 seconds. All right, fuck it. It's me talking. Skip forward 90 seconds. This is what they did. They put Lee Remick, she was standing up on a dolly, and they had behind her, the wall was done as the floor. And everything that's on the floor, like the rug and you know, the fishbowl that fell over, it's all attached to the wall, so that she's standing in front of the camera on this dolly. The dolly pulls her body back. She's doing the turn as if she's falling and landing on her stomach, but she's standing up the entire time.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's really cool. It's one of those, you know, you start rubbing your hands together going, ooh, I want to make, in my next movie, I want to do this sort of thing.
Well, sometimes those simple effects are the most effective.
Yeah, I know.
Actually, they did Hitchcock one better, because I always thought that process shot in Psycho with the guy teetering down the stairs backwards, I always thought that was pretty obviously a process shot or a rear screen shot. And it diminishes that scene a little bit. Earlier in his career, he was inclined to do all sorts of elaborate stuff to get an effect. I don't know if you've ever heard that story about how he built a giant brandy snifter. There was apparently back in the day, they didn't have camera or lenses that could get sharp focus of something in the distance and sharp focus of something near the camera. And they used to do later, they came up with a split diopter lens, which basically is two lenses that are cut together so that the stuff in the distance is sharp and the stuff in the foreground is sharp. And you see that being used even like in Robert Wise movies like Star Trek: The Motion Picture and The Andromeda Strain. So that was one way they handled that. Hitchcock, he didn't have split diopter lenses, so there's a scene with somebody sitting at a table and there's a person across from him. The person in the foreground has a brandy snifter. He wants that to be big in the front of the picture. So he built a giant brandy snifter and put that in front of the camera. So that's sharp and the person in the distance is sharp. So he did have, in the past, he was pretty inventive and creative. But maybe by the time he did Psycho, he was looking to get things done as quickly as possible. Psycho was shot with his TV production unit. So they probably were just sort of looking for the quickest way to do things. I also think that scene of him either going up or going down the stairs was shot on a day when Hitchcock was sick. He allowed his assistant director to do it. When he came back, he said, oh no, it's no good, we have to do it again. So maybe that's why they relied on that pretty obvious process shot when he's falling backwards down the stairs. But I don't know if I'm overly critical. Did you feel that was obviously a background rear projection? When he falls backwards, I guess the actor is who?
See, I was thinking it was more. I thought it was. He had a thing where he would move the camera and zoom in at the same time, moving the camera back and zooming in. I thought that's how they done that. Yeah.
The vertigo thing. No, I think he did use that. I don't know if he used it in Psycho, but obviously he used it in Vertigo. I think he might have been the first to use that in Vertigo. But in that shot, it looks like they have. Who the hell's the actor? He was around for years. He's a big actor. The guy that's playing detective, the private
Barbara
detective.
Guest.
Yeah.
Barbara Guest.
Yeah.
He's a very famous actor. He was around for, anyway, it looks like they put him in a chair or something and slid him backwards towards a screen, or maybe it was even a matte job. I don't know. Maybe it was, the background was superimposed. But I don't think that's him going down the stairs backwards. That looks like some sort of process shot.
First of all, it was Martin Balsam.
Martin Balsam, that's right, yes.
And I was always under the impression, and I could totally be wrong, but I was always under the impression that he was on a dolly going down the stairs.
Well, that's possible. Yeah.
And that the camera was fixed to the same dolly that he was attached to.
Well, that might be it. Yeah, that might be it.
You might be right, but that was my understanding, was that that was how it was done.
If they did that, if they put him on a dolly and the camera is attached to the same thing, then you probably would get an effect that would be similar to a rear projection shot, because the camera would be moving the same way that the actor is moving, which is usually the problem with rear projection shots, is the background is not moving in the same way that the person in the shot.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe that's why I thought it was a rear projection. But anyway, it looks a little phony, you know. And I love Psycho. I think that's a wonderful film, but that always sort of stuck out as being. So my hats off to Richard Donner for coming up with a more effective way of doing it, because I didn't realize that was a fake flaw. I guess that also explains why the goldfish bowl goes down first, right? Because we can't have the goldfish bowl crashing at the same time she's hitting.
Exactly.
Yeah. Another interesting thing: the goldfish were actually sardines painted gold because he didn't want to. He didn't feel like he should kill goldfish.
Well, good for him. That's
Yeah.
Why should you kill anything for
right? Yeah.
It's but I don't know how. I assume the dogs were well treated, but
yeah, they said they had problems with them. They would kind of flip out a little bit. They were kind of hard to control. I think during the cemetery scene, the stuntman for Gregory, he put on extra stuff because he saw the jaws of those things. He's like, crap. He even had like a little thin thing of, I guess, a thin sheet of metal or something.
oh, yeah.
He said when those dogs bit down, it bit right through that too.
Jesus.
Yeah. So they kind of have problems with. Maybe that might explain why they didn't use it in the remake, because there's, you know what I mean? So
I noticed in the remake, when they did the cemetery scene, they used that Saving Private Ryan effect on the action. Well, they were using every type of effect. It was like, we have this thing that doesn't look very good, so let's use every conceivable type of effect to make it look more like a movie. But I thought that really hurt that scene, because the reason why it works so well in the first film is you really get the feeling that the actors and the dogs are there and interacting with each other.
Yeah.
And
The only thing I liked about the remakes, and believe me, I can offer that film only very, very faint praise, and only in a few instances. But I will say that one thing I did enjoy was the way that scene in the cemetery was set in snow. That was one thing that I enjoyed about it.
Right.
It very much changed the atmosphere. Didn't necessarily make it better, but if you were going to do a remake of a classic film that is hewing so closely to the original film that the original screenwriter receives sole on-screen credit, as mentioned earlier, you've got to find opportunities to do something a little bit different. And I did enjoy that something as simple as changing what the basic location looked like and going from one stark example to another was something that I found, regained my interest, albeit very, very fleetingly. I also did very much enjoy the fact that there was an attempt to kill the Jennings character in a way that was also decapitation, but was not a shot-for-shot recreation of the original film.
Right,
did something a little bit different. That's pretty much the only thing I can give that film. And in any instance of atmosphere that is intentionally trying to evoke the same feeling as the original, but in a different visual way, I have to at least appreciate that aspect.
Of course, the snow, other than the snow that's on the ground, the falling snow, is another digital effect, right? So it's like another instance where they said, gee, what can we do to make this more visually interesting?
Right, sure.
Right? But it's interesting, the David Seltzer, this is sort of going back to the first film, David Seltzer credited Richard Donner for helping him to avoid a mistake that might have ruined the film, which is he told him to change his script to take out the cloven-hoofed demon creatures that he was going to have in that cemetery scene and put in the dogs instead. And Donner's main message, his main concept was that nothing overtly supernatural should happen. Everything should be explainable in some way. And boy, that sure does make a difference, because when you consider they were shooting on a very obvious set rather than shooting on location for that scene, if they had dragged out a bunch of people in robes with cloven hoofs, you know, and that would have destroyed the movie, right? That's like if they had had a real witch show up at the end of the Blair Witch Project, it just would have.
Right. Yeah.
It has to be left to the imagination, and in this case, you could say, well, those dogs aren't possessed. They're just a bunch of stray dogs that hang around in the cemetery, right? There's no reason why they shouldn't attack. What do stray dogs do? Especially Rottweilers. So
Right.
it makes sense. A reasonable person can come up with an explanation for that. Now, I don't know what sort of injury they were suggesting that Gregory Peck did with his arm. I find it hard to believe that they're suggesting that he actually impaled his arm on that spike.
It looked like it went all the way through.
It did look that way, yeah. That's kind of hard to believe. I also have problems with the cemetery scene because they show up at the cemetery looking for a particular grave, which was apparently dug 5 years ago, and in a minute they found it.
Yeah.
And the grave has the name of a woman on it, right? And there's a body of a jackal inside, a decomposed skeleton of a jackal. Why would they go through this trouble? Why would they leave a trail of evidence?
Right. Yeah.
And the grave opens up as easy as a piece of Tupperware, right? And inside, there's no coffin or receptacle of any kind. There's just the skeleton of the jackal, so it can all be done in one quick shot. And then, to make matters worse, he pops open the grave of the baby, and there's the baby, also not in any sort of box, but a big hole in its head, as if they said, let's make sure if somebody opens this grave, they can easily see that we killed it with a rock or something, right? Let's make sure that that's the thing on top. I mean, are they asking for Thorne or somebody to come along and piece together what happened? It certainly seems that way. The problem is all these things, if you took out all these illogical things, you wouldn't have a movie, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's also a movie that depends on sort of the way like old screwball comedies and farces depend on the characters never being able to get together in a room and say what they mean or give the other character the information that they need to understand what's going on. Everybody is always talking across purposes. Here you have a situation where this father, what's his name, Brennan? He shows up, and rather than saying to himself, now I'm going to be careful when I go in to talk to this guy because I don't want him to think I'm crazy because I really want him to believe me. And it doesn't matter if he believes the kid is the Antichrist. The only thing I have to do at first is to convince him that the people who gave him this child think he's the Antichrist.
Right.
That would be a good first step to getting him over to realizing what's going on, right? Instead, what does he do? Well, first they pick a Doctor Who actor to play the part.
Yeah.
And then he comes in and he's acting as crazy. I mean, it's like he has lunatic written on his forehead. Bulging eyes. You got to drink the body of Christ. You got to eat the body of Christ. And of course, Gregory Peck says, get out, you know. And the other absurdity is Gregory Peck is willing to meet with him another time, right? So they're out in the open. The devil waits until the priest tells him everything he needs to know to investigate the case. Then he kills him. Why would they do that? If they're going to kill him at all, why would they wait until after he disgorges all the information that he has, right? Gives all the clues about where to go and who to see and all that, and then they kill him.
Once you start going down the rabbit hole of why did God or the devil do or not do this in this film, yeah, you can't have any film at all.
Yeah.
If anybody behaved like a rational person, whether they're on the side of the devil or on the side of the folks that are trying to stop them, the whole movie would be 10 minutes long, right? Not to mention the fact, and this is something that even Gregory Peck complained about, the idea that a man in Thorne's position with his responsibility would accept some strange priest's offer to substitute his dead baby for a woman's baby. He doesn't know who the woman is. He doesn't know what's wrong with the kid. He hasn't asked to see he does ask to see, but he's willing to accept it when the priest says you don't need to see the dead baby. What would be the point? So what would be the point is I want to make sure that, you know, the kid is dead.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be the first thing that would occur to any parent if some strange person came to you and said your child died? So,
Yeah, but that's because I've seen The Omen.
Yeah.
Yes, we're all on God now. Yes,
Yeah.
and we're all
right.
checking our children's hair to make sure
Yeah.
they have. Did it
All
strike
right.
you that every time they did that scene in all the sequels, it got easier and easier to find that birthmark? I mean,
Yeah.
Gregory Peck has to be snipping for a half hour before he finds it. Subsequent ones, it's like, you touch the kid and you see that.
All right, Mr. Poe, what's your final thoughts on The Omen?
Oh man, I mean, it's a great movie. I liked it for what it is. I mean, I've watched it. Man, it's been a while since I watched it. I watched it again. Like I told you over the phone, I bought it on Vudu. It's on sale. And I mean, yeah, they meant it as a thriller, and I can kind of see that. But then when I went to buy it, it's in the horror section. So, yeah, I think, movies from that period, you had great actors. And then, as Erik pointed out, the little special effects they did, they kind of rigged some stuff up. And there's other stories. I really recommend people watch this and even get behind the scenes of things, and see how they did all the, special effects, especially the one where the glass cuts, the dude's head. I mean, that sheet of glass, that effect was pretty cool in how they come up with it, because there was something totally different they wanted to do. But yeah, I always encourage people to watch the classics, and this is a classic. So that's what I thought of it,
It is definitely a classic. Of course, it came out the year I was born.
Right.
I think it was really good that they had Gregory Peck in it. I think he really brought more to it, other than if they would have like an unknown or anybody else in it. And I love the kind of the slow pace. One of the better scenes that for some reason would be odd in movies today is whenever they're going to talk to the priest and they decide to stop and get coffee on the way, and it's like you wouldn't have that in movies today. But I think that really gave it, because like nowadays it would just be dialogue in the car, where the guys are going to stop on the road and get some coffee. I thought that was a great scene. I thought that brought a lot to it. But the rest of the movie, to me, when I watch it, it's nothing but dread and like cold, and I enjoy watching it. I thought it was really good. 2's good. Not a big fan of 3, and then I need to try to find 4 so I can watch it.
Yeah, me too. I gotta see this.
Erik, final thoughts?
I love The Omen. It's wonderful camp. It's camp. It's wanting to be The Exorcist. It's not The Exorcist. That doesn't make it bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that, The Exorcist is a really exquisitely seasoned and prepared fillet, and The Omen's a really fucking great cheeseburger. And so they're different things, and they both have wonderful qualities. But I love The Omen, and I love Omen 2. Omen 3 is a little dodgy. Omen 4 is fucking fantastic. If you have not seen it, see it with someone you love, or preferably someone you don't love, and subject them to Omen 4: The Awakening and skip the remake.
I have to make Billy watch it since he couldn't be on this show. Now, is part 3, is that the one where Jesus shows up at the end?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
The one where Jesus shows up.
Wasn't that awful?
If you've ever wanted to see Jesus show up looking for some back padding right after he did exactly nothing to resolve the crisis, then this is the movie for you.
Yeah, that should definitely be a rule. Never show Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus should not be in your movie, right? Because nobody's going to be happy with your presentation.
I do have a question, and I don't want to preempt your final thought here, but did anybody else have, speaking of Jesus and speaking of Omen 3, did anyone else wonder what the symbolism was, if any, in having all of Damien's Hamlet-style soliloquies and monologues that he's delivering in the black box theater chapel in his, ruined estate or whatever? He's always having these monologues in which he is talking in the presence of a crucified Jesus. However, the crucified Jesus statue is unlike one I've ever seen depicted.
Well, I think I can bring some insight into that. I think that's a Mike Hodges touch. Jesus is showing his ass, and there's one shot where Damien comes up and puts his arms on and is holding the thorns of his head, and the implication is he's symbolically sodomizing him. And the reason we can guess this is because later, when he gets the lady photographer in bed, he turns her over, and that's not because he wants to do it doggy style. He wants to sodomize her. And so this is, I guess, the way the devil enjoys himself, symbolically ass-fucking Jesus. And unfortunately for that lady photographer, oh, she's not a photographer, she's a reporter. Unfortunately for her, rather humiliatingly, she gets it up the ass from the Antichrist before losing her child in the last scene of the film. But,
well, it's interesting because I think what really supports your theory here is the fact that both the lady reporter, Kate somebody or other, and the Jesus in the Jesus statue have the same mullet. So there might be something going on there.
Also, there's at least one shot that's identical when he's over her shoulders and also when he's over the Jesus statue's shoulders. But that suggests to me that Mike Hodges had a much edgier script in mind, and that maybe that was one of the reasons why they were firing him. He took it in a direction they really didn't want to go, but he had something a little more outrageous in mind, which is probably typical of British film directors of his period. You know, he's wanting to do, I mean, he wasn't going quite to the extreme of a Ken Russell, but I think, and I'm guessing here, I don't know, but I think that was one of his touches. So that might explain that. I mean, there's no other possible explanation for having a crucifix with Jesus bare-assed. You know, that's.
Now it's interesting that when we were talking before about the novelizations and how Gordon McGill wrote an Omen IV and Omen V that represent what the movies would have been had the 20th Century Fox continued making them. That Omen IV opens up with the lady reporter essentially dying on the operating table as she gives anal birth to Damien Thorne Jr.
Well, there you go. So there's jackals giving birth, there's people giving anal birth. Apparently the Antichrist has the ability to mess everybody's biology up.
Oh, yeah.
If you have butt sex with the Antichrist, you will have a butt baby. That is what you are learning from the Omen series.
Well, let's cross that off our list, our bucket list, right?
All right, William, what's your final thought on the Omen?
Well, like I say, when I saw it as a kid, I was knocked out by it. Watching it again now for the first time in 30 years, I was initially down on it because of all these absurdities in it. It did seem to me to play more like a parody of a horror movie now, but that's the passage of time, and it's been parodied by so many other films and TV shows. When I saw the sequels and the remake, I realized just how clever Donner and Seltzer had been. So my hat is off to them. Obviously, you can't argue with success. They created something that is they're still trying to make money from it all these years later. So obviously they struck a bell with the audiences, and it's still an entertaining film, even though it's a silly film. I still enjoyed watching it, and the music is memorable, and it's nicely shot. And you're right, I think Gregory Peck was a perfect choice he has the gravitas that you want, something that Liev Schreiber, even though he might be a superior actor, he didn't really have. So it's, and the little boy that played Damien in the first film is much better than the kid that played it in the remake.
Right, yeah.
So for all those reasons, I'd say, yeah, it's definitely a horror movie that you have to see if you're a fan of horror. So it has an important place in the history of horror movies. And it's also interesting in terms of how studio films were being made right around that time, as they were trying to come out of that period when, there was so much insanity in the film industry. This was their attempt, I think, with films like this to assert some sort of control over things and get the studio's back in a position of dominance, which has been successful. Now, the auteurs, I mean, I don't even know what auteurs we would be talking about now, but studios dominate everything. It's basically Disney, and the films reflect that. I think the movies that are coming out today, including the OMEN remake, are devoid of any interest, in my opinion. They're not interesting films. They're not effective films. I don't think anybody who saw the OMEN remake thought, "Ooh, what a spellbinding film." It's that's the thing I would say about The Exorcist, and it's true to a certain extent of the Omen as well. So you could see the people who made it had their heart in it. They were really trying to make something good, which explains why somebody would be reduced to painting sardines. If you're going to go to that extent, obviously you're really trying, and that's something you don't see anymore.
Right. All right. Well, thanks again for both of you guys for coming here and talking with us about these movies. Enjoy talking with you guys. It's just great. Your insights that you have bringing to it is just awesome. Erik, where can everybody find your movies and find you on the internet?
You can find my feature films Roulette and Butterfly Kisses streaming on Prime, where you can support physical media and you can order Blu-rays of Roulette or Butterfly Kisses from Amazon, Best Buy, Barnes & Noble, any of those retail outlets. You can also read my obnoxious, snarky film criticism at Ain't It Cool News, where I write as Erik Christopher Myers or simply EKM.
I've been watching the door behind you, just waiting for somebody to come in with a knife. I'm glad it did. after your silent, your alarm went off twice.
Thanks for fucking up my sleep tonight. In advance. Thank you.
William, where can everybody find your movies at?
Well, Demon Resurrection is on Amazon. Should be easy to find. DemonResurrection.com. You can find where it's streaming and also find where you can buy the DVD if you're interested. And my first film, Sleepless Nights, I'm currently in the process of re-editing it and adding new special effects, and I hope to have that out in 2021. And that'll hopefully be available on DVD and streaming.
All right, looking forward to it. And again, thanks both of you for coming on here. And I guess we're going to have you back on for some Hammer horror later in the month.
Very excited.
Yes, that'll be fun. Mr. Poe, where can they find you on the internet?
Oh, they call me Mr. Poe on Instagram and all the other social medias, Slasher. But I'm also going to give a shout out to a band I made friends with. They got their new CD, Cauterized, self-titled EP, and you can get it through Kingside Records. So check them out, especially if you like some heavy metal. So, but yeah, that'll be my thing at the end of this one.
All right, and you can find me on Twitter at 1313A. Of course, I'm on Facebook. I've got all the social medias. I just don't use them all because I don't really know how to use them, most of them. But you can find the show on Facebook. You can go and find our group. Of course, we have our TeePublic store, and we have a Patreon page. Mr. Poe, you want to tell them about our one Patreon supporter we have?
Yes, our Patreon supporters is, and the only one, like you said, Mad Hatter's Boards. You can find them on Facebook. They have a group. What they specialize in is very nice made boards for your enamel pins or whatever. And they're pretty big in the pin community. So, yeah, check them out. And
I promise when I get my stimulus check, I'm going to send some money along to your Patreon.
There you go.
Oh, there you go.
All right. Again, thanks both of you for joining us, and I can't wait to have you back on.
Thanks very much, Carey.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
It has been established that persons who have recently died have been returning to life and committing acts of murder. The unburied dead are coming back to life.